Hey there, I want to talk today about cattle, and specifically grain-fed versus grass-fed. So just to set the picture, all cattle in Australia are raised on grass. It's how they finish their final days and weeks and maybe months, which is the telling factor whether they're grass finished or grain finished. And their length of time in a feedlot can vary between 35 days and 400, but typically it's about 50 to 120 days. And what that does is essentially remove that beast from its natural environment, be a paddock or a field, to a feedlot where things are very much easier to control. You create this controlled environment, so you are able to not be at the mercy of the elements and the variables that you are in nature, but now you're controlling their movement and you're controlling their feed. Now, why might we do this? Well, controlling their feed means that we can raise the weight of that animal, and particularly the fat of that animal, over a shorter period of time. So there's a cost-saving exercise there. It's my belief that a lot of this is, well, it's difficult to know which came first, the chicken or the egg. But we, the consumer, you and I, have a set of inherent subjective benchmarks that we expect, or expectations that our meat, protein, has to look and feel a certain way. Again, I'm not sure which came first, the producers or the consumers, in terms of what this criteria is and what is suitable. What do we say yes to and what do we say no to? And maybe there's, it's a bit of both. But essentially there's things like the color of the meat, the red hue of the meat, the fat coverage, the fat marbling, all those things create this checklist and this bandwidth of which is optimal and which is suboptimal in either direction. And if it's suboptimal, there's something within us that we eyeball that piece of meat and we pass. But if it's sitting within a parameter of a certain variables, then we eyeball it and we say yes, and it's in our supermarket basket or trolley. And so in a feedlot, you're controlling that tightly. You're controlling the movement of the animal, you're controlling the feed. And the feed typically is a mixture or a composite of grains. So sorghum, millet, rye, wheat, soy, that type of composite. So I get the reason why there is a need for this controlled environment, to establish these set of checklists that we have, this subjective checklist that we have as to what and how our beef should look. However, there's a consequence to that, and a lot of this stuff is based in values and largely unseen. It's intangible. You can't measure this stuff, but the consequence is, well, one thing you can measure is the consequence is no longer are these animals roaming through fields and pastures. They're in a much smaller pen without that freedom of movement, without the organic matter underneath their hooves. And so you have to protect that animal and the human food chain from bacteria breeding from the exchange of feces and etc. So there's that risk, and so that there's vaccinations that need to play a part in that world. So that's the feedlot rhyme and reason. I think it's largely partly this pressure and criteria that we have, subjective pressure and criteria that we have for how our meat should look. If we leave that animal on the paddock, yes, it may take longer because we're not controlling their feed as well as we can in the feedlot environment. But we can fatten that animal. It is possible to have the same weight at the end of the day. It may take longer, but that time is not wasted time. It's actually precious time. You think about what that animal is doing on the paddock. A, the animal's living arguably a better end of life. It's on a paddock, it's with its comrades, it's roaming, it's walking, it's mooing, it's pooing, it's doing all the things a cow should do. But it's setting up an environment that is giving that soil the best inputs that it can, right? What does a cow do? It chews on the cud. So it's keeping that vegetation in a vegetative state. It's then pissing and shitting, and then it's moving on. And if you manage it holistically, it's moving on possibly every 24 hours. And so that grass is constantly being nibbled down, not to its roots, but just enough to keep it in a state of photosynthesis. And once we do that, you know, photosynthesis is essentially taking carbon out of the atmosphere, turning it into sugars, donating some of that sugar to the plant for growth, restoring the grass that's been chewed, but also donates that into the soil, into the microbes, into the fungi, into the mycorrhiza, into the mycelium. And that's what enhances soil culture. That's what enhances soil microorganisms. And that is, again, not time wasted. So there is a bit of a debate, and there's a bit of confusion at the same time as to what constitutes grass-fed and what constitutes feedlot. So I'm not demonizing feedlot. I can see our part that we play in that, and I feel like that has been an education for Till and I in the Good Farm shop as to what happens when you get a steak that doesn't look necessarily like the steak that you might get in a high street supermarket chain. You're then challenged. That subjective criteria that you have inherently is somewhat challenged. It may look a deeper red, it may have more yellow fat coverage, it may have less marbling, it may taste more meatier, more gamey. These aren't necessarily bad, neither are the flavors and the textures and the appearance in the other model, but it's how we get there that is probably the important thing, and how we get there and how that reflects your values as to how that cow or how that animal has spent his or her final days and weeks. So if you want to learn more about grass finished versus feed finish or feedlot finished, then I've got a great blog on our website, thegoodfarm.shop, so have a browse through that. And any questions, just hit us up. All right, thanks guys.